Hey everybody, Asher here, and it's another month. It's time for another listing of class rankings in Hearthstone. Now, you may tell yourself or ask yourself, have things gotten a little bit stagnant in the Hearthstone metagame? I've heard a few people complain that they only run into one of three classes the whole time. But my argument that I'm going to put forward today is at least that things are not necessarily stagnant. In fact, I think things are pretty healthy. There are just a few classes that are definitely on the outside looking in. So we'll get there in just a minute, but to start leading towards that point, you may have seen on this channel I've done a series for Let's Get That Stupid Card Back, and how did I end up finishing at the end of the month? It is a grand total of, or no need for a ceremony, so drum roll here, rank 4 was where I ended up peaking. I did not make it up to 5, and there are 3 little lessons to take away that hopefully will help you all out as you all pursue climbing the legend, or maybe you've already climbed the legend and you can leave your thoughts in the comments on that as well. First being that, quite frankly, I didn't have enough time. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is work-related, life-related, everything else like that. And the other thing was that I wasn't using my time very effectively when I was playing. That's because of second mistake I made, which is not anticipating a shift in the meta in the middle of the month. If you remember some of the earlier on videos, climbing all the way up to rank 5 was fairly easy peasy, if only because I was running Tempo Warrior and eviscerating Zoo Warlocks and aggro Shaman and mid-range Shaman that were everywhere. My only bad matchup was mid-range Hunter. Well, by the middle of the month, a lot of people figured out finally that mid-range Hunter is really good against Warrior, not just Tempo Warrior, but Control Warrior as well. So what you got was me suddenly facing so much of a bad matchup, and once you get to rank 5, the people who are piloting the decks you are good against are significantly better than before. I wasn't using my time, what limited time I had, efficiently playing Tempo Warrior, just regular old Tempo Warrior. And that's probably the third mistake, is that I probably could have shifted to another deck, maybe it'd be Dragon Warrior, which has slightly worse matchups versus Zoo and Shaman, which I wasn't queuing into very much anyway, and would have done better versus the Hunter matchup, or maybe tried some other decks entirely, which is something that we're going to talk about today. Because if we look at the class rankings, one thing I want to talk about is something that Vicious Syndicates put out some good numbers in terms of games that have been played all the time, and what you get from analyzing that data, someone on Reddit did a really good job of this, is talking about the cycle of beats. Or in other words, it's not just that there is one dominant deck right now, though. There is a class that I've had at the top of my tier list at the beginning. That class hasn't moved. But when we talk about the cycle of beats, all I say is that is you have this nice diagram here to demonstrate to you is that everybody has a weakness in some way, shape, or form. I heard anecdotal evidence from plenty of people saying, hey, was last season a little bit harder to climb than maybe people were used to? And I guess a lot of people have done their legend climb in the past where there was a dominant deck. Something like Secret Paladin, something like Undertaker, Priest, or Hunter, where literally nobody could stop you. That isn't really the metagame right now, so that's where I say that maybe things are a little healthier than where people go. But the cycle's fairly simple. You have Warrior, which is strong, but is weak to Hunter, and Hunter, which will beat Warrior, but tends to lose to Shaman and Zoo, and Shaman and Zoo, which is strong there, tends to lose to Warrior. And I mean, this is not like total manifold everything gospel, but it is something worth keeping in mind that every class, every deck, no matter how OP it may feel, does have some bad matchups. So if you're going to be climbing this season or trying to scrounge your way up or play in tournaments, you may want to ask yourself, if you're going to bring a class, if you're going to bring something like that, do you want to go something that's within the cycle, or do you want to take something that's kind of outside of the cycle, something like Cthulhu Druid, something like Reno Warlock, and maybe work from there? So let's go ahead and get to the class tiers. We're going to start with number 1 on the list, which is Warrior. And Warrior, the deck that I've featured today, is Dragon Warrior, which is starting to become one of the more common themes that goes into here. Now, there was a big uptick of Cthulhu Warrior and Control Warrior on the ladder, but Dragon Warrior finally, after people were rumbling about it for a month, exploded onto the scene. And this is pretty much the list that you see with it. It looks a lot like a mid-range token Druid here. And it does. There are a few variants. There's some that run Sir Finley. There's some that run N'Zoth's First Mate, just for that early Zoo interaction. And Dragon Warrior is definitely interesting in a place, but there's not. I wouldn't say there's too much to discuss about Warrior. I think for this expansion, Warrior's pretty much cemented itself at the top. There's always an advantage inherent that you can have just by having a class that people don't necessarily know what to mulligan for. And then, of course, that Fiery Wind Axe is always going to be in the first opening draw. So second on the list, though, I have actually decided, and maybe a little bit controversially, to move around, and if I can just click the right thing here, to move around the rankings a little bit, we have in this position Warlock. I've bumped up Warlock to second place here. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that Zoo, while not very strong in a warrior-dominated meta, when everybody else tends to be trying to do things that counteract warrior, Zoo ends up being really freaking strong against the rest of the field. And Zoo is one of those decks that can definitely steal some games, something that some of the warrior decks can't say because they don't have enough burst. But Zoo is very good. But the reason that really bumped me up from this is Reno Warlock. Some of the lists are finally getting, I guess you'd say, more refined. And a lot of the Reno lists are very strong against the rest of the field as well. So if there's a deck archetype to look out for this month that may be making more of a resurgent popularity and comeback, it's probably going to be a Reno lock, maybe even specifically Cthulhu Reno lock. Yeah, that's a lot of archetypes to throw into one, but I do think it is something that's going to see an uptick. But just because Shaman's been knocked down to number 3, words that I was not expecting to say at the beginning of this expansion, doesn't mean things are bad. It's still tier 1, it's still top tier, and it's still a cut above the rest. What maybe has been the most interesting development in Shaman is that the aggro list and the mid-range list have started to intervene a little bit. So while their aggro-face Smork Shaman still has a place in the metagame, and I personally think it's the stronger deck, because sometimes it'll just get board states that your opponent can't deal with. What you're starting to see people develop with mid-range Shaman is a lot of them are starting to play Alakir the Windlord a little more. And that's an interesting choice. I mean, there's a lot of justification for it. Alakir is still a good in-game closer, especially if you can save your Rockbite or anything like that. He's Divine Shield and Charge, so he can immediately deal with the board. He can deal 8 damage. Very versatile card. The one downside, and this is just my opinion, is that he's a weaker Doomhammer. And a lot of Shamans are actually starting to put away the Doomhammers and just bring out Alakir instead. Now, that's an interesting development, but when you have the top of the meta essentially being warriors and then Shamans on there, it's a very weapon class dominated metagame right now. So people are playing a lot of counters to that. It's very interesting that warrior strength is actually bringing Shaman down. Not necessarily because warrior is a good matchup for Shaman. It's not. Even though control Shaman, which is I've seen bits of it come up more. I'm curious to see if anyone finally makes a list that sticks with the public, because Crusher Shaman, I ran into a few of them. I did pretty well with Tempo Warrior, but it's lurking out there. Someone's trying to make it work. But for mid-range, since you don't have that burst surprise factor in your deck necessarily, with Doomhammer, you can't always end your games faster. And so I think to that extent, it is at least a rung below Zoo for the time being, and thus a rung below Warlock. So moving on from the top tier to the middle tier here. At the very top of that middle tier is mid-range Hunter, or specifically Hunter. I know technically I'm throwing some of the deck types out here, but Hunter is really dominated by mid-range Hunter. You see a few people making N'Zoth try and work. We'll revisit N'Zoth here a little bit later down the line. But mid-range Hunter and Call the Wild is pretty much what's holding this class up, but it has such a good matchup with pretty much all the warrior decks, except for Pirate Warrior, which can kind of outspeed it, that oftentimes mid-range Hunter is really, really good. And Explosive Trap is actually pretty effective against Zoo. So you often have cases where if there's a Zoo-dominated meta, the mid-range Hunter can adjust and make it work from there. So Hunter is in a fantastic spot right now, much to my chagrin from playing Tempo Warrior last season. And as a result, because it does counteract a lot of warriors, whether it's beating down Control Warrior before they can get established, out-tempoing Tempo Warrior, Hunter is healthy right now without just being a mindless Chachi-style face Hunter. Next on the list, and for entirely different reasons for being up here in the mid-tier, is Druid. Now, Druid, since some of the cards got nerfed, specifically Combo or some of the other staple class cards, there's been a lot of people experimenting trying to make things stick. You have a lot of Yogg-based token decks, which are fun and very interesting. Even Whispers of the Old Gods making it work. Ty's had a pretty good run with a Beast Druid recently, but I still think the most stable Druid list, and the one I'm featuring here, is Cthulhu Druid. And the reason I say stable is because it's not a hard deck. It's not something that's just going to blow everybody out of the water and out of the way. There's not like a lot of sweet play potential. It's you play your stuff on curve, you ramp where you can, you get your Cthulhu out. The issue is that, and this isn't an issue for Druid, this is an issue for everyone that's facing it. They're so busy gearing up for warrior matchups, zoo matchups, even hunter matchups to a point, or shaman matchups, is that Druid kind of gets to sneak in there. Cthulhu Druid ends up having good, not spectacular, but good matchups with, or pretty much across the board, versus the other classes that kind of dominate the metagame. So Druid, in that sense, kind of gets a boost from that to a point. I'd say Cthulhu Druid is in a good spot. Like I said, it's not going to be something where like you get a ridiculous win percentage, and the games can get a little slow. But at the end of the day, if it's all about climbing in that win rate, Cthulhu Druid is stable. And for the middle ground of the middle tier, I think stable's fine. On the other hand, you have a class coming up next that is entirely unstable to a point, and that would be Mage. Now, there's two sides to the Mage coin here. One, we have Freeze Mage, which people are still trying to make work. And especially because we're in a control warrior dominated metagame right now, Freeze Mage is not working. But there's some people that are really good with Freeze Mage, and they've always been good, and they're much better players than me, and they swear by it. That's fine. I'm just saying that the more dominant or representative and probably better list is Tempo Mage. Now, Tempo Mage was a deck that I thought, hey, it was a prime for a comeback last time. And it wasn't wrong. A lot more people are running it, whether it's list from the Age of Service or otherwise. But when I say it is a deck that is less stable, it is because it relies on two huge random factors. One, the strength of the ping from the Flame Waker. In other words, you cast a spell, it deals 2 extra damage. And then secondly, throwing all those spells out there and then relying on Yogg-Saron to save you from your game. Sometimes you don't need to play Yogg-Saron, sometimes you have to pray to the old god and hope for the best. But I do think the Tempo deck or Tempo Mage is a good deck. I do think that as a result of Freeze Mage not being so good and Tempo not always being consistent, I have to put it lower than Druid. It's not that it's bad. Middle tier doesn't mean bad. It just means not as strong as maybe some of the other options if you're looking for consistency. Next on the list is a class that I am... Well, we can start talking about N'Zoth here now. Let's start with Rogue, which I do keep up in the middle tier, although it's at the bottom of the middle tier. And that is largely based on Miracle Rogue, which has still performed very well in tournaments. And pretty much any pro that I've heard or read talking about Miracle Rogue says it's not great for laddering. And I can see why, whether it's stressfulness or just some of the matchups, some of the cheese and tilting that you go into. But it's a very good tournament deck. But the other issue is that you have other types of rogue that are trying to emerge and they're just falling flat on their face. I saw a pretty big surge around the middle of last month in N'Zoth Rogue, and that's kind of faded by the wayside. Why is that? Because, and it's the same reason that I had concerns about putting N'Zoth in my pre-Whispers of the Old God top 10. N'Zoth by itself is a very good card, but it is a slow card. And the Death Rattle minions that you can bring back are not necessarily impressive. And if you play a 10 mana minion that does nothing on the board, that's pretty much a free turn. Now, if you can fit a taunt in there, what are your options for Rogue? You have Abomination, so that means your other Death Rattles are going to die. Or you have Infested Tauren, which, quite frankly, is just not a very good card. It's a good taunt if you want to have something to keep the board a little more stable when the N'Zoth comes out, but that's not a great reason to... It doesn't really strengthen the deck otherwise or fit very everywhere else. So Miracle Rogue's what's holding this up, and Miracle Rogue is still good, at least in terms, but in terms of laddering or anything, Rogue is still feeling the Blade Flurry nerf, and it's going to until the next set of cards gets announced. And then we're back to the low tier. We know who's going to belong here. Priest is no longer the dumpster, though. Yay! Here's the thing. With Priest and Paladin, their strongest archetypes for this expansion, their most consistent archetypes for this expansion, and this is arguable for Paladin, but we'll get there, are N'Zoth decks. And while there is Cthulhu Priest, which is okay, it doesn't have a lot of the taunt factors or very good, consistent, just straight up activation like Druid. and then you have N'Zoth Control, which we have an example of a deck here, which once again, it does a lot of things that control decks want to do. And Priest has always had, because of Entomb, really good matchups with Warrior. The problem is just that Priest, because it has pretty empty turns 1 through 4 and really relies on getting Doomsayers out or getting that Alchemy Circle combo, it gets run over by the rest of the field. So while you can try and sneak a Priest in there, it's just, once again, that loss of Velen's Chosen really hurts. And then we finally get to Paladin. And this is an interesting list because Paladin could bounce back, but I'm not entirely convinced about can it be consistent enough. So right now it's sitting in the basement. N'Zoth Paladin, which was once touted by Tempo Storm as being tier 1 until people realized you beat N'Zoth decks on turn 10, has kind of fallen by the wayside. I thought maybe some weenie aggro Paladin decks would make good. Turns out that they're just worse as Zoo decks, so they have the same matchups as Zoo decks pretty much, except they lose a little bit easier. What's the next Paladin experiment here? Bringing back the old Mysterious Challenger for Secret Paladin. Now, if you notice this list, and this is pretty consistent with a lot of Secret Paladin lists, we're not running a billion secrets anymore. Avenge is a very powerful secret that is no longer in Standard. So what we get instead is a lot of other interlocking pieces. This plays much more like a mid-range deck. Mysterious Challenger is not your huge power turn. And I guess that's where I get to a little bit of the trouble with this deck, is that maybe sometimes you can combo things like Dragon Egg and Steward of Darkshire and get all of that fun stuff out here. But at the end of the day, Secret Paladin is definitely a lot tougher to play than your old style of go on your golden curve, get out your Shield of Minibot, muster for battle, and win. I think just with Standard and everything like this, Paladin's just been gutted to a point, and it's going to take some time to get back. So let's recap here for just a second. We have a new season upon us. We have our top tier, our mid tier, and our uh-oh tier. And there hasn't been too much movement. There's been some interesting shifting back and forth, and certainly there's plenty of debate. By all means, it wouldn't be a tier list if you all weren't yelling at me in the comments about how wrong I am. But I have the top tier, Warrior, Warlock, and Shaman. Mid-tier, Hunter, Druid, Mage, then Rogue. And in the uh-oh tier, Priest, and then Paladin. So a little bit of movement all around, but I think the most important thing to think of is if you're going to be climbing this season, there's a big difference between getting to rank 5 and being able to just speed climb up there. Stars per hour really does matter. But when you want to get some consistent wins at the end of the season, I think the worst advice that I got going into trying to do a serious climb for the first time in a while is take one deck and stick with it. I think you need to have at least 2 decks that you go to, 2 or 3, and decks that do very different things. So if you have a deck that kind of slices down some of the aggro stuff, but you're struggling in some of the control matchups, maybe you want to take something else. And that's where I'm thinking that if there's a deck to watch for this month, it's Reno Lock. A lot of people expect Zoo, they mulligan for Zoo when you get a Reno Lock. It is a very difficult deck to pilot, as I can personally attest to. There's a lot of choices you have to make, and it's easy to make the wrong choice. But if you make the right choice, you can kind of navigate any kind of matchup. And if you're trying to climb those last stars without the bonus stars, sometimes you just need a deck that's a Swiss Army knife, and then Reno Jackson's your big bailout. So that's it for now. This is Asher. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to my prattling on. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what else you might be wondering about with the upcoming season for Hearthstone and Standard, and we'll do this again soon. Take care.